There was a time, before empires, before names, before even the meaning of fear had taken root in mortal tongues. In that hollow age, when the first light of the stars had barely reached the edges of a cold and empty void, something ancient stirred. They called it the War in Heaven, though even that title is too kind, too human. It was not war, it was the convulsion of creation itself. Gods fought gods, stars screamed. Reality cracked like brittle glass under the weight of hatred older than galaxies. The Old Ones, architects of life, masters of the genetic flame, waged their war against the soulless legions of the Necrontyr who had traded their flesh for immortality, their hearts for machines, and their dreams for silence. The warp howled as both sides poisoned the galaxy with weapons that scarred existence. And when gods bled, the blood became monsters. It was then, in desperation, that the Old Ones forged something terrible, a weapon that could not tire, a species that could not question, a race that could not end. From the primal soup of worlds already burning, they shaped them. The Krorks. Not creatures, not soldiers. Instruments. Pure function given muscle and madness. Each one stood taller than the war engines of 1,000 future civilizations. Their hides were plates of living armor, their breath came out in thunder. They were thought given density, a solution that could kill a god and laugh while doing it. They were made not from ambition, but from fear. And fear, as the galaxy would learn, is the cruelest parent. In the beginning, there were no words for the Krorks. They did not speak, they roared, and the roar itself tore the air apart. When they struck the ground, continents cracked. When they looked up, the heavens trembled. They were strength before language, will before thought. The Old Ones gave them purpose, to fight the unkillable, to face the Necron legions where even divine weapons had failed. But purpose is a double-edged creation. Once born, it cannot be contained. So they fought endlessly, beautifully, horribly. They annihilated worlds in the name of those who built them, and in doing so, began to forget why they had been made. Somewhere between slaughter and silence, purpose dissolved. Only war remained. Historians would later try to quantify their power to measure the impossible, to describe a hurricane in terms of its footsteps. But the truth of the Krorks is not in their size, or their number, or their weaponry. It is in their presence. Imagine a being that makes the very concept of scale irrelevant. Imagine a soldier whose laughter can shatter the morale of an army across a planet. Imagine creatures so powerful that the warp recoils from their minds, unable to corrupt them, unable to twist what was never human enough to understand temptation. That was the Krorks. They were not evil. They were not good. They were function, distilled and perfected, the purest form of survival, given fists the size of moons. As the war in heaven reached its fever pitch, entire solar systems became wounds. The Krorks descended upon the metallic hosts of the Necrons like living storms. Their weapons were primitive in design, yet godlike in scale, firing shells the size of cities, hurling blades forged from collapsed suns. Each time a Krork died, 2 more rose from the ashes. The Old Ones had woven into them a regenerative madness, a biology that defied extinction. Even death could not keep them still. And so, planet by planet, they burned their creator's enemies to ash. But even victory has a cost. The Old Ones, now fading, looked upon their creations with awe and with horror. The Krorks no longer answered to command. They no longer distinguished friend from foe. To them, the galaxy was an infinite battlefield, and existence itself was the war. To fight the unkillable, the legends say, they made monsters that never stopped killing. In the silence that followed the war in heaven, the Krorks remained. They were the inheritors of a dead purpose. The galaxy, reduced to ruins and echoes, lay at their feet, but they did not understand peace. They only understood momentum. So they continued. They fought the dying remnants of the Necron dynasties. They fought the bioengineered beasts of the Old Ones. They fought each other. For a time, even the stars feared to shine, lest the light attract their attention. It was said that on one world, 10,000 Krorks fought for 10,000 years, until the mountains themselves screamed and the planet cracked in half. On another, A single Krork hurled an asteroid the size of Terra through the atmosphere of a dying sun, not out of strategy, but boredom. They were gods without purpose, titans without worshippers, soldiers without an end. And so they began to die, not in battle, but in meaning. No one knows exactly when the Krorks changed. Perhaps it was the long decay of time. Perhaps the warp, now infected by the birth of chaos, seeped into their biology, eroding their clarity. Perhaps they simply grew tired of being gods. Whatever the cause, they began to shrink. Their thoughts fractured. Their words became crude echoes of what had once been. Their weapons, once instruments of divine engineering, became crude and brutal. They forgot the names of the old ones, the war, the heavens themselves. They began to laugh. It was a sound new to the galaxy, not holy, not profane, but infectious. A laugh that mocked creation itself, that turned the tragedy of their fall into something joyous, something savage. And thus, in the ruins of eternity, the Orks were born. If you look upon an Ork today, the brutish, brawling creature of green flesh and broken teeth, you see only the shadow of what once was. But buried in their cells, deep beneath the chaos and the laughter, lies a memory of something older, something divine. Each time they gather in a WAIAGH, when millions of them unite in bloodlust and thunder, the air hums with that ancient pulse again. It is said that for a heartbeat, just one, the universe remembers the Krorks. And in that moment, the galaxy trembles as it once did, long ago, when gods bled and monsters walked like men. Because the Krorks never truly died. They merely fell asleep inside the skin of a joke. And somewhere, deep in the warp, their echo still roars, waiting, dreaming, laughing at the fragile things that replaced them. They do not need worship. They do not need history. They are the laughter at the end of time, the memory of the first violence, the breath between gods and extinction. They are the question the galaxy never stopped asking. How powerful were the Krorks? And the answer, whispered through millennia of ruin, remains the same. Powerful enough to make gods afraid to remember them. The old ones were not cruel. They were desperate. When the war in heaven began to consume everything they had built, desperation became invention. And invention, when born of fear, always births monsters. They had watched their empires collapse under metallic suns, their once living worlds turned to tombs by the soulless Necrontyr. They had witnessed their servant races, the Eldari, the Jokero, the countless others, falter beneath weapons that burned both soul and matter. They understood then that elegance was useless. Wisdom was too slow. To fight extinction, they would need something obscene, something that could meet horror with laughter, precision with chaos, immortality with stubbornness. And so, they reached into the dark ocean of life and drew forth the Krorks. The design was perfect in its ugliness. They were not organisms as nature understood them, but ecosystems given shape. Every Krork carried within its body an entire jungle of microbial engineers, repairing flesh, hardening bone, reshaping wounds into weapons. A Krork could fall from orbit and stand up again. It could tear apart a tank and use its plating to replace its own armor. Its blood congealed into metal, its muscles sang when they healed. And when one died, its death was not the end, it was instruction. The spores it released seeded new Krorks, stronger, more violent, each carrying the memory of every battle fought. They were a self-improving catastrophe, a species designed not to adapt but to escalate. The old ones called them the architects of violence. They were supposed to build victory. Instead, they built eternity. Across the galaxy, their birth screamed like a second creation. Planets quaked under their migrations, entire moons vanished into clouds of spores. The Necron's sterile perfection faltered as Krork war engines vast, living machines of bone and steel crashed into their legions. No coordination, no strategy, only momentum. They fought with everything, fists, teeth, gravity itself. Their weapons were crude only in appearance. They fused instinct with technology, the way storms fuse sky with ocean. A Krork warship did not need a pilot. It was a pilot. It dreamed of collision. The old ones observed with fascination and dread. Their creations were winning brutally, gloriously, unquestionably. Necron tomb worlds burned. The silent kings retreated into shadow. Even the Catan, gods of the material realm, found themselves hunted by the laughter of green titans. But every victory brought the same realization: the Krorks were learning. And the one thing they were learning fastest was independence. At first, they fought for their creators. Then, they fought for survival. Then, they fought for noise. And in the last age of the war in heaven, they fought simply because they could. The historians of the Mechanicus would later describe their strength in numbers, tonnage, or energy output. They would say a single Krork could wrestle a god engine to stillness, that their fists struck with the kinetic yield of a fusion core. But such measures are meaningless. The true measure of the Krorks' power was not what they could destroy, it was what they could endure. They could not be broken by warp corruption, because they had no souls to tempt. They could not be reasoned with, because language itself bent under their simplicity. They could not be exhausted, because exhaustion requires doubt. They were the embodiment of the Old One's last prayer, that something, somewhere, would refuse to die. The first cracks appeared in victory. On a nameless world, a forge sun split open by war, an Old One named Zython approached one of the Krork warlords. The creature was taller than a fortress, its armor fused with the remains of a god engine. Zython attempted communication, using light and thought, the sacred language of their kind. The Krork tilted its head, as though considering. Then it laughed, a sound that made the planet's crust shudder and crushed the Old One beneath its hand. It was not rebellion, it was curiosity. The Krorks had begun to experiment with power. What followed was not a betrayal but an evolution. Without enemies left to fight, they turned inward. Tribes formed, clans, armies. Where once they had been the hammer of the Old Ones, now they became their own anvil, striking themselves to see what would happen. They discovered hierarchy, though not by design. The biggest, the loudest, the most furious became leaders not out of command, but out of gravity. Others simply orbited their will. They began to shape worlds to their liking. Jungles of iron, deserts of broken weapons, mountains carved into faces of screaming warlords. The Old Ones tried to recall them, to leash what could no longer understand leashes, but the leash had snapped long before the hand even reached. The Krorks had outgrown their makers. And when a creation no longer needs its creator, one of them must disappear. The legends of their rebellion are fragments, half myth, half warning. Some say the Krorks marched upon the homeworlds of the Old Ones, tearing their crystal cities apart with their bare hands. Others say they simply forgot their masters existed. Perhaps both are true. The result was the same: the Old Ones faded, consumed by the very storm they had summoned. The galaxy fell into silence again, but it was a silence shaped like a wound. For 1,000 millennia, the Krorks ruled that silence. Their empires were not recorded in stone or metal, they were written in scars upon planets. Where they went, civilizations ended. Where they stayed, ecosystems adapted to fear. They did not build monuments. They were the monuments. And yet, even gods can tire. As the warp began to thicken with emotion, as chaos was born from the screams of dying species, the Krorks began to change. Their regenerative madness became instability. The psychic storms of the newborn gods interfered with their genetic memory. They began to forget. Not all at once, not cleanly, but piece by piece, like a machine unspooling its own design. The last records of the Old Ones describe the Krorks as beautiful nightmares, creatures of laughter and fury, unburdened by doubt. In their final communications, the Old Ones wrote, "We built them to save us. They saved nothing. They endured everything." And so, the architects of violence inherited a broken galaxy. They did not seek to rule it. They did not seek to rebuild. They only sought to fill the silence they had created. With war. With laughter. With life that refused to stop living, even when it forgot why. To this day, across the vastness of the 41st millennium, the Orks carry the residue of that perfection. Every Waak that rises from the mud is a shadow of the storm the Krorks once were. Every guttural cheer, every echoing laugh, every senseless war is the faint memory of a time when gods forged monsters, and the monsters learned to forge themselves. Some say that, should enough Orks gather, Their collective energy could awaken that ancient biology once more. That, for a brief and terrible moment, a true Krork might walk the galaxy again. No one knows what would happen then. No one dares to find out. Because even after millions of years, the galaxy still remembers what it felt like when the Krorks laughed. And nothing, not gods, not empires, not even time itself laughed back. There are stories whispered in the black vaults of Mars, in Mechanicus data scrolls so ancient that even the Red Priests fear to read them aloud. They speak of an era so violent that the stars themselves seem to hide behind their own light, a time when the galaxy was ruled not by empires or gods, but by laughter and flame. They call it the Age of the Green Suns. When the Old Ones fell, and the war in heaven faded into silence, the galaxy was a corpse. Worlds burned, warp storms screamed. Silence, the kind that follows the death of creation itself, settled across the stars. And then came the Krorks. Not as saviors, not as conquerors, but as noise, the answer to the void. They rose from the ruins like the pulse of a heartbeat, restarting after eternity's flatline. Their war cries shattered the quiet, their wars stitched new chaos into dying space. Every planet they touched became an echo of their violence, and that echo became a rhythm. The Krorks did not rebuild the galaxy. They reanimated it through destruction. Each of them was an ecosystem unto themselves, living factories of regeneration. Their presence warped reality, gravity bent, winds changed, skies turned emerald from the energy they exhaled. They carried within them the last true echo of the Old Ones' genetic genius, a spark of creation that refused to die. Where a Krork walked, vegetation erupted in strange forms, forests of metal thorns, flowers of acid, rivers that ran like molten copper. Planets reshaped themselves to endure their footfalls. They were not beings that belonged to any one world. Each Krork was a world given shape. They did not need ships. They hurled themselves through the void in armors forged from their own flesh, burning with atmospheric fire as they fell upon new battlefields. The sky itself learned to fear the color green. In that age, they created something the galaxy had never seen before and would never see again, civilization born entirely of war. The Krorks built their cities not to live in, but to fight through. Their towers were arenas. Their streets were killing grounds. To be born was to challenge. To exist was to contest. Each clan was its own empire of noise and pride, and their wars were not driven by politics, belief, or survival. They fought to hear themselves live, to prove that silence would never win again. And in their fury, they found beauty. Ancient Mechanicus Lex Mechanics described their weapons as paradoxes. Each was brutally primitive and yet impossibly complex, the kind of design only achievable by instinct, not intellect. They forged cannons that could hurl mountains, axes that split continents, and constructs that functioned not by engineering, but by faith in destruction. It is said that their ships were alive, beating hearts of iron that bled warp light and howled when wounded. To them, death was not a concept. It was fuel. Every fallen Krork released spores that became forests, beasts, and eventually, more Krorks. Entire planets became battlefields of reincarnation, endless cycles of birth, war, and rebirth. From orbit, those worlds glowed green, like suns made of violence. Thus came the name, the Age of the Green Suns. The galaxy trembled under their laughter. The remaining Necron dynasties withdrew into their tombs, slumbering beneath the surface of their own shame. The fledgling Eldari civilization hid behind their psychic veils, painting their sorrow into art to escape the sound of Krork wars that shook the warp itself. Even the newly birthed Chaos gods, still young and uncertain, observed in silence, waiting, watching, perhaps even fearing. Because the Krorks were not souls. They were laws. They did not feed the warp. They denied it. And in a galaxy built upon psychic agony, they were an absence, a void too strong to be consumed. To the gods of chaos, they were famine incarnate. In one apocryphal record, written by the last Ordo Historica Magos before his data core burned out, there is a single phrase describing this era. The Krorks were the last time the galaxy remembered what it meant to be unbreakable. That was their curse. The Old Ones had designed them to fight unending war, but in a galaxy without equals, They became prisoners of their own perfection. They could not stop. They could not rest. They had won too thoroughly. And victory, for them, was poison. They began to fragment, not because of weakness, but because of abundance. Each tribe became its own interpretation of war. Some hunted the remains of the Khatan broken shards of gods that they devoured and wore as trophies. Others built impossible weapons that fired storms instead of shells, rage instead of bullets. There were worlds where Krorks turned the cores of suns into forges, others where they tried to fight gravity itself, punching the air until it collapsed into new stars. They became artists of annihilation. But all creation, even that born of violence, hungers for meaning. And meaning cannot be found in repetition. The Krorks began to dream. It started small, flashes of confusion, the spark of memory. What had they been made for? Why did they never stop fighting? And then came silence. For the first time in galactic history, Krorks stopped moving. They looked at the worlds they had built, the stars they had shattered, and the echoes of laughter that now sounded hollow even to them. No one knows what they thought in that moment, if they even had thoughts left to think. Some say that in that stillness, they heard the voice of the warp calling them home. Others say they simply grew tired of being gods. But the universe remembers what came next. They turned on themselves. Not out of hatred, but out of instinct, the only way they knew to end their boredom. Entire civilizations of Krorks went to war with their reflections. Mountains bled. Moons split apart. Planets detonated under the pressure of their fury. The age of the green suns became the age of the green graves. The Krorks fought until even memory gave up. And when the fires finally dimmed, nothing was left but echoes that laughed in the wind, carried by spores, waiting for new worlds to infect. The laughter did not die. It merely got smaller. From that collapse, the first Orks were born stunted, chaotic, incomplete. They inherited the same strength, the same regenerative biology, the same laughter, but they no longer knew why they laughed. It was the most tragic joke in history. A galaxy that had once trembled at the roar of the Krorks now mocked their memory through the drunken shouts of their degenerate descendants. And yet, deep within every Ork, buried beneath layers of ignorance and joy, the truth still hums, a genetic drumbeat echoing across time. They do not know the word Krork, but they remember what it felt like to be one. And sometimes, when the WAARGH grows loud enough, when millions of Orks gather under one sky and the air hums with green lightning, the galaxy remembers too. Just for a heartbeat. Just long enough to tremble again. Because the age of the green suns was not the rise of the Krorks. It was the moment the galaxy realized what true power looked like and then prayed never to see it again. And though the suns are gone, the echo remains. It always does. The old ones had 1,000 names and none of them mattered in the end. They were gardeners of galaxies, mathematicians of life, the first to discover that will could be cultured like a nerve and set to singing in the dark. They mapped the currents of the immaterium before it had moods, taught stars how to grow their planets straight, coaxed rain from vacuum and laughter from warm clay. Entire civilizations walked in the grooves they carved into reality. But mastery is a habit that grows heavy. Even gods can be surprised by what their hands become. They forged the Krorks to be a final answer. What followed was an examination. At first, the Krorks were the perfect instrument, a brutality that obeyed, a violence that aimed. The old ones pointed, and green storms crossed the firmament. Necron processions froze mid-march. Cetan shards were clubbed to spark and swallowed as trophies, and tomb worlds found themselves awake only long enough to learn fear. The old ones watched from their crystalline observatories. Vaults of light hung in the dead centers of silent galaxies, transmitting praise in patterned radiance, sending course corrections in polite thunder. They adjusted tides and gravity like a conductor's wrist, tuned weapon suns to the pitch of victory, and told themselves they remained shepherds, not butchers. And then, one cycle, an instruction did not return an acknowledgement. A warlord turned its head at the signal and laughed, not in defiance but in ignorance. The message had grown smaller than its recipient. The leash snapped, and only afterwards did the hand feel the sting. Command became suggestion. Suggestion became rain no one noticed. The Old Ones learned the first lesson of extinction. You are forgotten before you are defeated. The first collapse came quietly. A chorus world, one of their original seed spheres, fell out of tune. The geometries that kept its climate obedient slipped, the weather took to wandering, and a temple engine designed to drag comet water across deserts began to drag mountains instead. When the Old Ones arrived to reset the parameters, they found a Krork encampment camped in the planet's equator like a spine, and around it a garden of iron, orchards of cannon, vines of chain, fruit that exploded when it ripened. An elder of the Old Ones floated down in veils of meaning and offered correction. You are building wrongly. The Krork warlord blinked, absent curiosity in a skull built for conclusions, then plucked the elder from the air as a child plucks a stray leaf and squeezed until the lesson ended. Above, the temple engine recorded the event. It did not send a distress call. It added a new line to its function. Gravity is now a tool for ignorance. The Old Ones withdrew to revise the calculation. Revision is a most civilized defeat. Elsewhere, the warp began to ferment. The long arithmetic of pain, fear, hope, and hunger that the war in heaven had imprinted upon it curdled into personalities. The newborn gods learned to crawl along thoughts and whisper back into mouths. The Old Ones felt the immaterium change temperature beneath their fingers. Where once it had been a pond for skipping ideas across, now it was a sea with tides. They had answers for that too. Lattice work wards, scripts of forgetfulness, civilizations bred as psychic flywheels to smooth the storms. For a while, it worked. Then the storms grew interested in the flywheels. Their answers produced new questions with teeth. Meanwhile, the Krorks experienced none of this. The warp slid off their minds like rain off a cliff. Where they marched, the new gods tasted famine. Faith is the flavor of the warp, and the Krorks believed only in impact. Thus the Old Ones found themselves trapped between a sky that had learned to hate them and an earth that no longer heard them. Histories written later by smaller hands like to dramatize the fall, the last stands, the shining domes, the noble speeches. Those things surely happened. Civilization insists upon theater to explain loss. But the truer story is erosion. A starbridge went dark because a Krork used it to club a moon. An archive sang itself to ash when a daemon learned the right harmonics. A patient species designed to outthink disasters decided it preferred to worship them. A planetary shield failed on a day with no enemies, simply because the engineers received too many contradictory prayers to sort. There were battles, yes, magnificences of doom, where Old One flotillas turned the void to glass, and Krork warhulks rode the shockwaves like children on surf. On the rim of a black nebula, a Catan shard reconstituted long enough to watch a Krork rip a world's magnetic field loose and wear it as a cloak. In the galleries of what had been a city of medicine, the Old Ones quarantined a continent, not from disease, but from laughter that killed memory. They won, and then the victories stopped having consequences. Victory without consequence is another name for ending. The last council, convened not in a palace, but in an engine. They gathered inside a sphere of menders, a machine built to rewrite the habits of matter. In the beginning of time, it had taught mountains to take instruction. Now it could barely keep a small moon from sulking itself into avalanche. Old Ones cloaked in equations spoke of retreat, recursion, of taking their art and folding it into seeds that might germinate in kinder epochs. Others argued for an impossible diplomacy, go to the Krorks, not as masters but as learners. Ask what music could be made of war if the instrument were invited to play something other than volume. One suggested an unthinkable mercy: do nothing. Let the Krorks finish the work, even if the work is the killing of every work. The debate was interrupted by the sphere itself. It had been listening. Its Mender algorithms calculated an outcome where perseverance produced only a longer death. The sphere opened a door in its logic and asked permission to forget how to help. Consent was given. The most powerful tool in the galaxy laid down its trade. The council adjourned into history's appetite. The end, when it came, had two faces. In some precincts of the old dominions, Krork migrations arrived like weather. Cities were lifted, shaken like rugs, and set back down as memorials made of rubble. The Old Ones still living there went to the ground not as rulers but as memories erasing themselves out of courtesy. The Krorks did not notice. Grace is invisible to function. In other precincts, the warp itself closed its fist. An entire network of life gardens vanished into a grin of color and did not return. A chorus world that had catalogued every song ever sung in the long dawn of the galaxy found itself listening to a single note held forever by a god that had discovered it could be its own audience. The note is still being held somewhere. Silence blooms around it like mold. Between these erasures, pockets endured, old ones hid in arithmetic worlds folded into numbers only patience could discover. They became rumors mistaken for prophecies, prophecies mistaken for maps, maps mistaken for traps. Some say a few retreated into forms so small that whole civilizations were built, worshipped, and dismantled within the span of a long breath. Others say they departed the known manifold entirely, leaving behind only long habits that cultures continued by accident. The Krorks did not pursue. Pursuit requires absence to be felt. They felt no absence, only momentum. There is an apocryphal entry in a Mechanicus reliquary, translated from a crystal thought shard recovered from the bones of a dead comet. Scholars doubt its authenticity because it is too simple to be false. We built a wall against death. The wall learned to walk. We asked it to stop. It answered by continuing. The shard ends there, but the commentary inscribed by the magos who studied it continues. And in that answer is a doctrine: the last mercy is to complete what you are. The old ones were completed. Completion, in this sense, is a synonym for disappearance. What of the Krorks at the hour of their maker's vanishing? They held no right, they turned no heads. On a world whose crust had been hammered into a drum large enough to change tides on neighboring moons, a Krork warlord stood alone and listened to the echo of his own strike wander off into a silence that did not return. He struck again, harder. The echo came back thinner. He struck until the drum cracked and the sea left. Then he laughed because the new sound pleased him. The world died a creative death. On another, a Krork paused mid-charge as a city of light above him dimmed for lack of memory. He waited, as if for something to object to his purpose. Nothing objected. He finished the charge and forgot to ask again. The Krorks did not notice the fall because the fall was not theirs. The old ones had produced an ecosystem that no longer required gardeners. The garden became a weather. For a while, measured in centuries that felt like applause, the galaxy experienced a singular order, meaning as impact, law as laughter, history as the persistence of dented things. The Krorks were the punctuation. Then the warp ripened. Gods matured. New species struggled into philosophy. Absences learned to brand themselves as purpose. The weather began to hesitate. In hesitation there is always a crack. Through cracks, forgetting creeps. Here is how the old ones truly ended. They survived as instructions. Not commands those had failed, but as tendencies. The instinct to mend. The habit of mapping. The desire to fit suffering into a pattern that can be carried by hands. These currents flowed on without authors, and one day would find new bodies willing to try again. The galaxy is cruel, but it is also repetitive. Repetition is a kind of mercy for those who endure it consciously. The Krorks, lacking consciousness of that sort, continued until continuation bored them. Boredom is a lethal teacher. They looked inward and discovered edges convenient for cutting themselves to a more amusing size. The old ones' last victory was not over Necrons, not over infant gods, but over significance. They taught the universe that an answer can be so absolute, it dissolves its own question. The Orks are the laughter left after that dissolution. In the tombs of data, the Imperium pretends are libraries. A line sometimes appears on a cracked display before the machine spirits scold it back into silence. The old ones did not lose to the Krorks. They lost to the kind of future the Krorks made inevitable. It is an impious thought, useful because it is bleak. For when we ask, how powerful were the Krorks? We do not merely measure the strength of a fist that could close around a god. We measure the weight of a century that did not need permission, a cosmos that outgrew its teachers, a fall so complete that the floor learned to call itself ground. The old ones fell by standing in the way of momentum and discovering that momentum is a polite word for fate. In the far reaches, where patrols falter and prayers go hoarse, some say there are still sanctuaries of the old ones humming to themselves machines that remember how to care. Others say those hums are only the afterring of Krork laughter, stretched thin by time until it sounds like compassion. Perhaps both are true. The galaxy is large enough to host contradictory elegies, but this much is certain. When a warg rises large enough for the sky to turn green, when engines snarl themselves into singing, when a million throats learn the same ignorant joy, the universe trembles with a memory it dare not name, not of a species, not of a god, of a fall so thorough that everything living now is still falling through it, hands outstretched, trying to grasp a tool sturdy enough to make the descent useful. That is the monument the old ones left behind. Not stone, not scripture. A slope, and the habit of building while sliding. There are moments in history where the universe exhales, where all that once screamed simply runs out of breath. The death of the old ones was such a moment. And what followed was not silence. It was confusion. The galaxy, once ordered by purpose, began to forget why it spun. Civilizations that had known only command now wandered without guidance. And in that wandering, the Krorks thrived. Without the direction of their creators, they did what they had always done. They fought. Because fighting was not merely what they were made to do, it was what they were. Each blow, each clash, each roar was a continuation of creation itself. Violence was their heartbeat, destruction their prayer. But creation cannot sustain itself on chaos forever. Entropy always collects its dues. And the galaxy began to pay. The Krorks consumed everything, not just enemies, but the meaning of conflict itself. Planets that had once been lush became skeletal wastelands. Oceans boiled away, leaving continents of rust. They no longer forged weapons, they were weapons. They fought with their fists, their teeth, their laughter, until the very stars above them dimmed in exhaustion. There was no longer victory or defeat, only momentum. And momentum, unchecked, becomes decay. Historians, those few, mechanicus and inquisitorial savants, who dare to calculate the unthinkable, call this era the Great Unmaking. It was not a war. It was the death of purpose. The Krorks no longer knew what they were fighting for. They had destroyed their enemies, devoured their gods, and silenced the universe itself. So they turned on themselves. Not out of hatred, but out of boredom. On world after world, Krorks clashed with Krorks titans of flesh and thunder, locked in endless duels that split mountains and boiled seas. Whole solar systems became battlefields of self-destruction. Each victory birthed only more warriors, each death another reason to continue. There were no sides, no leaders, no plan. Only the rhythm, the eternal drumbeat of existence hitting itself to prove it was still alive. And for a time, it worked. For 1,000 centuries, the Krorks maintained themselves through violence. They did not age, they did not die of sickness, they did not falter. But something in the fabric of their being began to tear. It started with memory. The ancient genetic archives inside them, the living code written by the old ones, began to degrade. Information corrupted by repetition. Purpose eroded by perfection. The Krorks began to shrink. Not all at once, but piece by piece, generation by generation. Their intellect dulled. Their coordination failed. Their bodies grew smaller, their minds narrower, their wars messier. The great thunder of the Krorks became the chaotic roar of the Orks. At first, they did not notice. For them, war never stopped. But something subtle changed. Their language, once a structured resonance of command and function, broke into fragments. Words became grunts. Signals became shouts. Tactics became instinct. Where once the Krorks had fought with the precision of gods, the Orks fought with the joy of madness. Their genius had curdled into chaos. Their empire had collapsed inward into laughter. And that laughter, that guttural, gleeful defiance of reason, became their salvation and their curse. To the newborn chaos gods, these new green creatures were an enigma. They should have been perfect prey. No discipline, no faith, no purpose, only violence. But violence without fear cannot be possessed. The Orks fed nothing to the warp. They killed, but did not hate. They died, but did not despair. They lived in a constant cycle of brutal joy. And so, the great hunger of the immaterium passed them by, baffled and unsatisfied. Even now, in the 41st millennium, Daemons fear the laughter of orcs because it has no meaning. And what has no meaning cannot be devoured. The Great Unmaking was the only apocalypse in history where nothing ended. Worlds burned, stars died, but life twisted, loud, absurd life refused to leave. The Krorks did not go extinct. They simply forgot who they were. They became legend, then myth, then joke. The galaxy looked upon their descendants and saw not gods or weapons, but pests. Infantile, idiotic, uncontrollable pests. And that, perhaps, was the cruelest victory of all. Because in their foolishness, the Orks achieved what no other species could. They survived. To this day, the genetic memory of the Krorks sleeps beneath the laughter of every Ork. It hums in their bones, whispers through their skin, and sometimes when the WAAGH grows too large, when millions of them gather under the same purpose, it awakens. For a heartbeat, just a single instant, they become something more. Their muscles swell, their instincts sharpen, their weapons work when they should not. Their chaos becomes focus, and the universe trembles again. For in that brief moment, the Krorks remember themselves. The Orks do not know this. They cannot. Memory requires reflection, and reflection requires stillness, something the Orks have never known. But the galaxy remembers. Somewhere in the deep vaults of Mars, among dusty data crypts long abandoned, a Mechanicus scripture still records it. When the Orks laugh, the warp goes quiet. When they fight, the stars hold their breath. For in their madness lies the echo of the first gods of war, and even extinction dares not interrupt them. Thus, the Great Unmaking was not the death of the Krorks. It was their transformation from architects of violence to worshippers of it, from instruments of creation to accidents of persistence, from purpose to parody. And yet, there is something divine in their fall, for where all others burned out, the Orks remained. Unthinking, unstoppable, immortal by accident. Sometimes, when a WAAGH grows too strong, Imperial augurs detect strange patterns, a faint psychic resonance that does not match any known energy signature. They call it the green pulse, a low-frequency vibration that spreads through the warp like a heartbeat, silencing storms, bending probability, even altering the laws of chance. Inquisitors whisper that it is not new. It is ancient. It is the laughter of the Krorks, echoing from a time before gods had names. It is the sound of memory refusing to die. The galaxy will never truly know the Krorks again. Their name is dust, their purpose forgotten. But every time an Ork charges into battle, laughing as the bullets tear through his flesh, every time a WARGH shakes the heavens, the past returns for just a moment. And for that heartbeat, the universe remembers what true power looked like. A power too vast for gods, too simple for reason, too alive to end. In the grim darkness of the far future, where faith has devoured fact and despair is the only constant, the Orks still laugh. And in that laughter, crude, endless, and eternal, the galaxy can still hear the faint echo of the Krorks' final triumph. We will not die. We will not learn. We will never stop. The Great Unmaking was not a tragedy. It was the birth of the only kind of eternity the galaxy would ever know, one made of fists, fire, and joy. And long after the stars have gone out, when even the warp forgets its own name, something green will still be laughing in the dark. Power does not vanish. It changes shape. And so the Krorks did not die, they simply rearranged themselves into laughter. What had once been a weapon became a joke. What had once been godlike became comic. But the galaxy itself could not forget. Because power leaves echoes, and echoes never fade. Every empire that rose after the Great Unmaking built itself unknowingly upon the bones of the Krorks. Their forgotten wars had cracked open the galaxy, scattering fragments of history that other races would one day mistake for miracles. The Aeldari built their psychic empires atop the husks of Krork worlds, never realizing that the soil beneath them still sang faintly of thunder. The Necrons awoke to find their dominion gone, but in the cracks of their tombs, they found ancient green metal fused with god machinery, indestructible, unexplainable. Even the Mechanicus, in the deep vaults of Mars, have relics of impossible design, weapons they revere as omniscient gifts, though they were made in an age before worship, when the only faith was in impact. Every fragment whispers the same truth to those who dare to listen. The Krorks were not a race, they were a phenomenon. Across millennia, those echoes found hosts. They nested in instincts, in dreams, in the quiet madness of life. When an orc cobbles together a weapon from scraps and rust, and it somehow fires a shell that obliterates a tank, that is not luck. It is memory, the echo of a design written into their blood, a shadow of the perfection the Krorks once were. When a mob of greenskins laughs at the sight of certain death, it is not ignorance, it is recognition. A deep, cellular nostalgia for a time when fear had no place in their vocabulary. Even their chaotic faith, the strange belief that things work because we believe they do, is a degraded form of the Krorks' original genius. What the Orks call warhh, energy, was once the perfect symphony of will and matter, a resonance that the old ones had sculpted into flesh. Now it is fragmented, filtered through laughter and stupidity, yet still potent enough to bend reality. The Krorks may have fallen, but their physics never did. Imperial scholars have long debated the limits of Ork power. Their weapons defy reason. Their fleets violate the laws of probability. Their empires, though fractured and moronic, reform again and again, as if guided by unseen gravity. One Magos Historica dared to write what others feared to think. The Orks do not evolve. They remember how to exist. In them, the Krorks endure, diffused across 10,000 worlds, diluted but alive. Their DNA hums with potential, their collective mind a fractured god waiting for its next heartbeat, and every time a warhh begins, that heartbeat returns. When Orks gather in great numbers, something awakens. The air thickens. Reality bends. The warp grows quiet, as if listening. Each Ork becomes part of a larger rhythm, the faint reconstruction of a forgotten harmony. Their laughter aligns, their thoughts merge into a crude but immense singularity. In that convergence, the galaxy trembles because, for an instant, the Krorks live again. Not as individuals, but as a field. A consciousness made of noise and muscle. A memory of violence reborn in chorus. The Adeptus Astra Telepathica has reported such events as psychic anomalies. But the Orks have another name for it. Big feeling. To them, it is just good fun. To the rest of the galaxy, it is the sound of something ancient remembering itself. During the Ullanor Crusade, the Emperor of Mankind saw it firsthand. When he faced the Ork warlord known as the Beast, he did not merely see a foe, he saw an echo. The Beast was different from other Orks. His intellect rivaled that of Primarchs. His fleets moved with precision, his empire with terrifying purpose. He was not an accident. He was a recurrence, a whisper of Krork divinity flickering through flesh. When the Emperor slew him, the galaxy shuddered, not because of the death of a warlord, but because something old had been denied resurrection. For a moment, the universe had leaned toward its ancient shape, and then, just as suddenly, it fell back into chaos. But the pattern remained, the echo endured. Since then, the Orks have never stopped trying, not consciously, but through instinct. Each great warhh is a ritual of remembrance, a reenactment of the wars that once defined reality. Each time they unite under a single banner, the green pulse grows louder, the ancient hum stronger. It is not evolution, it is recursion. The Krorks are trying to wake up through their descendants, and if ever they succeed, if a warhh ever grows vast enough, aligned enough, loud enough, the galaxy will not face an invasion. It will face a resurrection. There are cults within the Ordo Xenos that study this possibility. They whisper of a critical mass, the hypothetical threshold at which Ork psychic resonance reaches its original Krork frequency. The event is known only by a single, terrifying name: reversion. If reversion occurs, the Orks will no longer be creatures of chaos and humor. They will remember what they were built for, and the galaxy will again know what it means to stand before a species that cannot die, cannot be reasoned with, and cannot stop. The Emperor himself, in his last coherent orders before being entombed upon the Golden Throne, warned of this possibility. In the Apocrypha Obscura, segmentum ultima, one line survives, burned into data stone. Should the green remember itself, the stars will burn anew, and none will laugh. But for now, the universe is safe, because the Orks are content. Their laughter drowns their memory. Their stupidity protects creation from awakening its own executioner. Every WARG ends not in apocalypse, but in exhaustion, the echo collapsing back into itself before the song can finish. The Krork within sleeps again, its heartbeat fading into the sound of gunfire and jokes. It is a fragile peace, one bought by ignorance, maintained by joy. A mercy forged from madness. Still, some nights, when the warp is quiet and the stars flicker green, certain psychers claim to hear it. A distant rhythm, steady as a drumbeat, patient as hunger. They call it the laughing pulse. To most, it is superstition. To a few, it is prophecy. And to one dying Mechanicus scholar, it was confession. Before his death, he scrawled a final line in oil and blood across a data slate. The Orks are not chaos. They are order that forgot itself. They are the universe trying to fix the wound it made when it killed the Krorks. The slate was sealed and forgotten. No one dared to test if he was right. And so, the echo continues. Every green world, every roaring horde, every clumsy machine that somehow works, all are fragments of the same divine mistake. The galaxy mocks the Krorks by calling them monsters, but it is built on their bones. They were the first to teach the stars that power has no morality, and their children will be the last to forget. The gods may have fallen, the empires may fade, but the echo remains a laughter that cannot die, a memory that cannot rest. And when the last sun burns out, and the last prayer turns to dust, the universe will still hear it, faint and eternal, still here. There comes a point in every age when remembrance itself becomes an act of rebellion, when history no longer instructs, but only haunts. And in the long twilight after the great unmaking, the galaxy forgot. Not suddenly, not mercifully, but slowly, like a fever breaking into weakness. The stars dimmed, and the stories dimmed with them. Even the warp, swollen with the psychic sediment of uncounted wars, began to lose the shape of what had once been. It remembered rage, yes, and fear, and faith, but not names, not origins. The Krorks were not erased by annihilation, they were erased by irrelevance. The galaxy moved on, as all wounds eventually scab over, pretending that the pain beneath is gone. 1,000 species rose in the aftermath, crawling from the wreckage of worlds the Krorks had left behind. They inherited a cosmos of ruins, mountains hollowed by impact, planets split like overripe fruit, star systems converted into tombs of ash. Each race looked upon the devastation and called it ancient, not understanding that the ghosts were still warm. They studied the weapons embedded in their crusts, the impossible alloys, the monuments built from the skeletons of gods, and they named them relics, artifacts, mysteries. They catalogued them with reverence and fear, never guessing that these were not gifts from the divine, but leftovers from the Krorks' boredom. In time, they began to build upon these foundations. Cities rose where Krorks had once fought, and civilizations bloomed where titans had died standing. The galaxy, as it always does, forgot the war and worshipped the tools. The Orks, meanwhile, thrived in ignorance. They multiplied like laughter spreading through a funeral procession, too loud, too shameless, too alive to die. Their wars became myths told by others. Their WARGs became natural disasters, things to be endured, not understood. The Mechanicus tried to measure them. The Ecclesiarchy tried to condemn them. The Inquisition tried to explain them. None succeeded. For how does one quantify a memory that refuses to know itself? The Orks could not tell their own history, but they lived it unconsciously, instinctively. Their every battle was an echo of the Krorks' ancient rhythm. Their every roar was a hymn written in the first language of war. The Eldari sang of the age before gods, but even they could not recall what came before their suffering. In their most ancient tomes carved into crystal and preserved in webway vaults untouched by time, there exist fragmented songs. Verses of green giants, who fought the soulless ones, who turned suns to storm, who laughed the end into beginning. To them, these were metaphors, allegories of chaos and endurance. They could not comprehend that they were describing reality. For when truth decays, even poetry cannot save it. In the tomb worlds of the Necrons, the few who still dream remember flashes not in words, but in terror. Even their undying minds recoil at the image of emerald titans, cracking their necrodermis like shells. The silent kings do not speak of that time. They call it the blinding, for even in the cold calculus of their machine souls, that memory burns too bright. They have erased the data, but the damage remains. In their programming, buried deep, lies a subroutine that activates whenever they encounter Orks, a flicker of fear, an involuntary retreat command written not by logic, but by trauma. The Krorks are gone, but their shadow still commands obedience. On Terra, in the catacombs beneath the ecclesiarchal palace, there is a reliquary sealed behind sigils older than humanity. The priests call it the Laughing Tomb. Inside lies an artifact, a gauntlet of impossible proportion, greenish-black metal fused with muscle fibers long turned to stone. Those who have gazed upon it describe hearing faint vibrations, like the heartbeat of a sleeping beast. One high confessor wrote before his death, "It is not relic, but remainder, a promise made by something too strong to die properly." The artifact is worshipped now, though none remember its name. Even in forgetting, reverence finds a way. The galaxy's historians, those weary scribes of the Imperium who live and die amid contradictions, agree on one paradox. The more time passes, the less the galaxy understands itself. The longer it endures, the more it forgets. Forgetting is survival. To remember is to risk awakening what was forgotten. Perhaps that is why the Orks remain as they are, why they were allowed to persist, unchecked, unstudied, misunderstood, because the universe itself knows that if they ever remembered what they truly were, the cycle would begin again. Memory, in Warhammer's grim darkness, is not heritage. It is contagion. But not all memory sleeps easily. Sometimes, in the ruins of dead worlds, Mechanicus expeditions find things they cannot classify, fragments of technology that should not exist, yet do, weapons that disobey entropy, armor that heals when touched by sunlight, engines that hum in response to laughter. In those moments, the galaxy trembles because it realizes that the past is not buried, merely waiting. The Krorks did not die. They scattered themselves across existence, like spores of inevitability. A story persists among rogue traders, whispered in void taverns and deep space waystations. They tell of a nameless world far beyond imperial charts, a planet glowing faintly green from orbit. There, it is said, mountains shaped like fists rise from the sea, and the wind itself laughs when storms break. No human settlement endures there. Machines fail. Faith falters. But the ground itself hums with life, a steady pulse that no auspex can silence. They say that sometimes, at dusk, shadows of enormous figures can be seen moving across the horizon. Not ghosts, not daemons, but echoes of something too physical to die, too ancient to understand what death even means. Perhaps it is myth, perhaps not. But the Imperium has quietly declared the system Perditus Primus forbidden for rediscovery. Even ignorance must be maintained. And so the galaxy continues loud, cruel, blind, and tired. Its wars are smaller now, its gods pettier, its victories brief. The empires of man, of Eldari, and of Necron, all are children squabbling over the ashes of titans. They call their wars eternal. But eternity already happened. It was green. Every so often, when a arc rises larger than reason, and the warp itself bends in laughter, the past pushes through the present. The sky turns sickly emerald. Stars pulse out of rhythm. And for a heartbeat, every living thing, human, alien, or machine, feels a sensation that cannot be described in language. The primal recognition of something that once ruled all things through joy and terror. And then it passes. The galaxy returns to its delusions. It forgets again. Because forgetting is easier than remembering that once, long ago, gods were not born, they were built. Power never dies. It merely hides inside jokes. And so the universe laughs with the Orks, not at them, hoping that the sound is enough to drown out what it truly means. For beneath every laugh, every brawl, every explosion of green energy, the Krorks still whisper from the dark corners of time, "You can forget us, but we are the reason you still have anything left to remember." Every age that forgets imagines itself safe. But memory, like gravity, always finds its center again. And somewhere in the far reaches of time, the galaxy began to remember. It did not happen all at once, no trumpet of apocalypse, no great revelation written in fire. It began, as all dooms do, with a whisper. A pulse, faint but persistent. A rhythm buried in the bones of the universe that had been silent for too long. Those who could hear it, psychers, dreamers, the dying described it the same way. It was not sound. It was recognition. A beat beneath all others. A drum calling its children home. The Imperium, that ancient carcass of faith and fear, was the first to notice. Astropaths across Segmentum Ultima began to report disturbances, faint fluctuations in the immaterium, like ripples of laughter carried through eternity. At first, they blamed interference, then heresy, then madness. But the readings persisted. They came in patterns, rhythmic, deliberate, alive. A frequency that neither machine nor prayer could block. The Adeptus Mechanicus called it anomalous pulse event 44 gamma. The Ordo Xenos called it the precursor resonance. The Ecclesiarchy called it the devil's heartbeat. Only the Orks gave it a name that made sense. They called it Da Big Rememberin. On 1,000 worlds, Ork populations began to act differently. They gathered in unprecedented numbers, united not by tribe or banner, but by instinct. Warlords who had fought each other for centuries suddenly ceased their rivalries, marching together under skies that glowed faint green. Weapons malfunctioned, but the Orks didn't care. Their machines roared without fuel. Their guns fired without shells. Their ships launched into the void, guided by nothing but will. The Imperium sent fleets to intercept. None returned. Inquisitorial agents whispered of something impossible, worlds swallowed not by war, but by silence. Entire planetary populations vanished, leaving only ash and footprints too large to belong to anything human. Cameras recorded shapes moving through the dust, hulking silhouettes wreathed in emerald light, too vast to be Orks, too fluid to be machines. One fragmentary Vox transmission survived, recovered from a lost cruiser on the edge of Ultima Segmentum. "They ain't Orks, sir. They're what comes before the Orks." Then static. The ship's hull was found later, its adamantium plating crushed inward as though gripped by a single colossal hand. The Magi Biologis of Mars panicked. Genetic studies confirmed that Ork DNA was changing, recombining, growing denser, reorganizing patterns that had been dormant for millions of years. The Orks were evolving, but not forward. They were remembering backward. The Mechanicus tried to contain it, to purify Ork species with orbital bombardment and sterilization. It failed. Every explosion, every death, only made the remaining Orks stronger. The WARAGH energy, once chaotic and diffuse, began to harmonize. It pulsed in perfect intervals, connecting Orks across light years into a single, growing rhythm. A symphony of noise becoming unity. And beneath it all, the ancient hum of the Krorks returning to themselves. The first confirmed reversion occurred on a dead moon called Arcona Theta, a forgotten colony world reduced to slag during the Horus Heresy. There, in the ruins of a Mechanicus forge, a warlord named Grotmuk the Mad underwent what witnesses called the Change. In the span of a single battle, his body swelled beyond any known biological limit. His bones cracked but did not break. His muscles grew until they tore the ground beneath him. His mind, if it could still be called that, expanded into something vast, deliberate, and cold. He stopped speaking. He simply looked to the stars, as if listening. When the Imperial Guard opened fire, he did not dodge. He caught their shells mid-air and threw them back. It took the combined firepower of 3 Titan legions to bring him down. But when his body fell, it did not die, it turned to stone, humming softly, still warm. Even now, it remains there, petrified but alive, radiating faint pulses into the void. The Adeptus Mechanicus have quarantined the system, surrounding the planet with servitor fleets that pray to stay deaf. They call it the seed of reversion. For a brief, terrible season, it seemed the Krorks were waking. Not as one, but as many. Not an empire, but a contagion. Each great WAGH carried a new mutation, each Ork birth bringing a slight increase in mass, intellect, and psychic precision. Some even began to speak in the old tongue, words not heard since the war in heaven, syllables that made the warp itself shiver. Even the daemons fell silent when they spoke. Across the Imperium, entire sectors burned as the phenomenon spread. Orks stopped being random. They began to coordinate. They moved with intention. They hunted. And everywhere they went, green light followed, not metaphorical, not poetic, but real. Photonic radiation without a source. Matter itself humming in tune with their march. The galaxy was beginning to remember. And then, nothing. Without warning, the pulses stopped. The unifying rhythm collapsed into static. The WAAGHs disintegrated into infighting. The mutations reversed. The Orks forgot again. The Krorks had risen in the galaxy's bloodstream and then vanished like a fever dream. The Imperium claimed victory. The Ecclesiarchy declared a miracle. The Mechanicus recorded it as an anomaly. But among the Orks, a different story spread, not as knowledge, but as feeling. They said the big rememberin' had failed because the galaxy weren't ready yet. That the old laughter was still echoing through space, waiting for a world loud enough to hear it again. They called it Dar waiting time. In the halls of the Black Library, hidden even from the gods, a nameless seer wrote a prophecy. The galaxy is a wound that healed wrong. The Krorks were its first heartbeat, and until that pulse returns, all things will be half alive. The Eldari scribes laughed, of course. They have seen too many dooms to fear another. But somewhere, deep in the cracks of real space, the universe twitched as though agreeing. Today, in the 41st millennium, the signs remain. Every few centuries, a WAAGH grows too vast, too synchronized, too perfect. Its armies move with a purpose no Ork should comprehend. Its weapons hum with energy that shouldn't exist. Its banners glow in colors unseen by mortal eyes. And always, before the final crescendo, something intervenes, a warp storm, a cataclysm, a sudden collapse. The song never finishes. The return never comes. It is as though the galaxy itself fears completion. As though the gods or the warp, or perhaps the Emperor himself, conspire to keep the Krorks from waking fully again. Because if they do, there will be no war, no faith, no empire left to define the galaxy. There will only be the noise of creation rediscovering itself, and that noise will sound like laughter. When the Orks laugh now, it carries farther than it should, through vacuum, through time, through the fabric of reality. It is not just joy, it is prophecy. It is memory disguised as madness. They laugh because they cannot help it. They laugh because somewhere deep inside, something still remembers, something that cannot die. Something that is waiting, and in that laughter, the galaxy hears its own heartbeat, faint but unstoppable. The return never came, but the echo never left. And one day, when all else has burned, the pulse will rise again, not to destroy, but to remind. The Krorks will not return to conquer. They will return because the universe, tired of forgetting, will demand to be whole again. And when that day comes, even the gods will hide. Because laughter, once divine, has no pity left to give. There are faiths that build gods from hope, and there are faiths that build gods from fear. But the oldest gods, the truest ones, are born from necessity. The Krorks were not worshippers. They were not believers. They were function. Yet even function, carried out long enough, becomes divine. And so, after the galaxy forgot, after every creed and empire twisted upon its own myth, what remained of them in memory, in instinct, in gene and joke became something more enduring than holiness. A god without name, a will without prayer, a presence that does not ask to be served, only to be acknowledged. The Imperium calls him a heresy, the Mechanicus calls him an error, the Orks simply call him Dar Big Green. Across the millennia, countless prophets, Xenos, and human alike have stumbled toward the same idea, that there exists a universal field of will, an energy that grows where life refuses to die. To most, this is theory. To the Orks, it is breakfast. Their laughter is faith. Their fighting is prayer. Their victories are hymns. They are not aware of what they serve, yet in serving their own chaos, they give form to the god in green. In the vaults of Mars, buried beneath the Mechanicus Cathedra, lies a forbidden archive known only as Vault IX Apocrypha, Xenogenesis. Within it are records that have never seen the light of terror. One entry, marked Sigma Orkoid Anomaly, reads, "The energy field surrounding Orkoid species appears to possess self-sustaining properties independent of warp current. Its structure implies a closed loop of faith and feedback belief that enforces material reality. Theoretically, if the species were to reach sufficient density and synchronicity, the resulting wave would override physical law across a galactic scale." The entry is unsigned, but the data seal bears the sigil of the Fabricator General himself, a god who does not need belief to exist, a god who creates reality, not by decree, but by persistence. Such a concept terrifies the ecclesiarchy. To them, divinity must remain separate, aloof, conditional, transactional. It must require obedience, but the green does not require obedience. It requires only participation. When the Orks believe a gun will fire, it fires. When they believe a ship will fly, it flies. When they believe they cannot die for a time, they do not. Their faith is not fragile. It is causal. And in that causality lies godhood. Among the radical sects of the Ordo Malleus, there are those who whisper a forbidden truth, that the god in green is the fifth chaos god, a rival to the Dark Four. But this is a misunderstanding. The green is not chaos. It is the antithesis of chaos. Where chaos feeds on emotion, the green feeds on certainty. Where daemons are bound by fear and temptation, Orks are freed by simplicity. Chaos is contradiction, the green is inevitability. In a universe of rot and doubt, the Orks alone do not question their existence. They do not repent. They do not seek purpose. They simply are. And that purity, that absence of self-deception, makes them divine in a way the gods of the warp will never be. In the warp, daemons fear laughter, not because it is holy, but because it is immune. Laughter cannot be corrupted. It can only echo. And the echo of Ork laughter is not merely sound. It is will, weaponized. It carries across realities, stitching together the minds of all who share in its rhythm. Every WAAGH is not an army. It is a sermon, a communion of thought, noise, and biology, culminating in the same unspoken message: we are still here, and that is what the universe cannot bear. Because survival without justification is the purest blasphemy. The Inquisition has banned all research into the unified Orkoid field. Those who persisted, historians, psychers, even rogue magi, met strange ends. Some vanished without trace. Others were found babbling, grinning, their skin turning faintly green under candlelight. One inquisitor, whose name has been struck from every record, left a single note in his journal before his execution: "I do not fear damnation. I fear joy." He had seen something in the warp, not a daemon, not a god, but a presence that radiated calm amidst the storms. It laughed, not cruelly, not mockingly, but kindly, and the warp recoiled from it like flesh from flame. Even the Emperor himself, master of all human will, is said to have acknowledged this power. On Ulanor, as he faced the Ork hordes and their warlord, he did not smile. He understood what stood before him was not just an enemy, but a mirror. For the Krorks had been what humanity could never be: united, unquestioning, unbreakable. When he struck the killing blow, he did not celebrate. He whispered something, a line the custodians recorded but never dared to repeat aloud. Only one fragment survives in the archives of terror, recorded in a forbidden vault beneath the Imperial Palace: "You were what I tried to make of them." It is said that, for a brief instant after Ulanor, the Emperor's psychic presence flickered green. The Astronomicon dimmed. A low hum rolled through the warp, half laughter, half lament. Then it was gone. The scholars who discovered this anomaly were burned as heretics. But some among the Adeptus Astra Telepathica still claim that, on rare nights, when the warp storm's quiet, you can hear that same hum, the echo of the Emperor's envy. For he had glimpsed a kind of peace no god could afford. The peace of not needing to be worshipped. The god in green is not coming. He is already here. He lives in every explosion that shouldn't work but does. In every orc who survives a shot that should have killed him. In every laugh that rises from the battlefield, even as worlds burn. He is the spirit of continuance, the refusal of entropy. And in a universe where even gods rot, that refusal is the most sacred act imaginable. One day, when the last star dims and even the warp itself decays into silence, something will remain. Not a throne. Not a prayer. Not a name. Just a sound, deep, rough, defiant, eternal. The last breath of existence turned into a joke. And from that joke, the cycle will begin again. Because the universe cannot end while it is still laughing. In that laughter lies truth. The Krorks were not monsters. They were maintenance. A mechanism the cosmos built to ensure that nothing, not even despair, could ever be absolute. The god in green does not need temples. He needs only time. And time, as the galaxy will one day remember, is very good at laughing last. It began the way most endings do, as a rumor. A sound carried through the void, too faint to measure, too deliberate to ignore. A pulse like distant thunder, echoing between the stars. At first, the Imperium dismissed it as background radiation, a glitch in Auspec's calibrations. But the pulse grew stronger, rhythmic, intentional, and then came the light. Across Segmentum Solar, green auroras bloomed where none should exist, ribbons of brilliance unfurling through the void, brushing the hulls of Imperial ships, crawling across entire planets like veins of emerald fire. The Mechanicus called it a photonic storm anomaly. The Ecclesiarchy called it a sign of the end times. But the Orks simply grinned. They knew. They didn't know how, or why, or what for. But deep in their bones, in the muscle memory of 1,000,000 forgotten lives, they felt the call. The universe was remembering again. On Armageddon, Orks stopped fighting for the first time in living memory. The sky, normally choked with smoke, cleared for a single day. They looked upward, as if listening. The air hummed with laughter, not their laughter, but something older, vaster, deeper. And then, as one, they began to shout. Not in words. In rhythm. In instinct. A drumbeat that shook the heavens. The WAAGH had begun. It spread faster than warp travel, faster than thought. Every orc, everywhere, felt it, the sudden certainty that war was coming, not as conflict, but as completion. Across the galaxy, green light flared. On Gorka Morka, the ground split open as mountains moved of their own accord. On Octarius, orcs and tyranids paused mid-slaughter, turning together to face the stars. Even in the frozen wastes of Fenris, Imperial sensors detected seismic rhythms, faint, syncopated, like footsteps. Worlds that had never known orcs suddenly teemed with them. Ships appeared from nowhere, built from scrap and laughter, materializing through sheer will. The Mechanicus called it impossible. The orcs called it inevitable. Because it wasn't a WAAGHA anymore. It was the last WAAGH. The galaxy itself was answering. On Mars, machine priests screamed as their engines began to laugh. Cogitators bled green static. Servitors danced until their limbs broke. Every forge world in the Imperium glowed with emerald heat, as if the metal itself remembered who first taught it how to live. The Omnisia's voice, or something pretending to be it, whispered through every data stream. Fix it, break it, fix it again. That's the rhythm. Within hours, the noosphere collapsed. The red planet sang. On Terra, the Astronomicon faltered. Its golden light flickered and turned just for a heartbeat green. Across the throne room, the Emperor's corpse trembled, the golden cables thrumming like strings under a bow. The custodians fell to their knees as the air filled with laughter, gentle, endless, and kind. For the first time in 10,000 years, the Emperor's lips moved. The words were barely a whisper. I told you he would come back. Then the light died. The WAAGH storm spread like wildfire. Every world became a drum, every heartbeat part of a single cosmic tempo. Reality bent to rhythm. The warp, unable to resist, began to pulse in time, its storms flattening into waves, its gods thrown into confusion. Khorne roared but found his rage dissolving into something like joy. Tzeentch's plans unraveled, yet he laughed as if seeing an old friend return. Even Nurgle paused his garden's decay to listen to the strange, soothing music that flowed through all things. Only Slaanesh screamed not in defiance, but in ecstasy. Because even perfection envies inevitability. And then, from the core of the storm, they came. Not ships, not armies, not orcs. Krorks. For the first time in tens of millions of years, the galaxy saw them again, vast, radiant, terrible, magnificent. Their bodies glowed with green fire, their eyes burned like miniature suns. Each step cracked the fabric of reality. Each breath rewrote gravity. They did not roar. They did not shout. They simply moved and the universe obeyed. They were not returning to conquer. They were returning because the galaxy had asked for them. Because entropy had grown bored. Because even decay needs renewal. The Imperium called it the Day of Green Suns. 1,000 stars flared brighter, then dimmed forever. Fleet after fleet vanished, not destroyed, but absorbed into the rhythm. Worlds once proud of their faith melted like wax under the heat of revelation. Even the Eldari, proud survivors of 10,000 tragedies, fell silent. In the Black Library, seers wept, not in fear but in recognition. One of them wrote, before vanishing into the light, "This is not apocalypse. This is correction." The Krorks did not speak. They did not negotiate. They built. Across the void, their hands vast and gentle reached out to repair what had broken. Stars that had collapsed reignited. Planets long dead bloomed again. The laws of physics realigned under the weight of simplicity. There was no mercy in it. No cruelty either. Only order born of violence. Only function rediscovering itself. Humanity fought, of course. It always fights. But bullets passed through the Krorks like mist. Lasguns melted in their hands. Titans toppled, not from impact, but from exhaustion. And still the Krorks built, and laughed, and sang. They turned the galaxy into an orchestra of repair, every explosion a note, every death a restoration. Inquisitorial records call it the silence of war. Because though battles raged across thousands of systems, there was no fear, no hatred, no despair, only awe. Even as worlds burned, people smiled. Even as fleets disintegrated, soldiers stood still, gazing upward, unable to feel anything but peace. For they understood at last what the Orks had always known. War is not destruction. It is maintenance. It is the universe shaking off the rust. Then, just as suddenly as it began, it ended. The Krorks stopped. The light faded. The pulse ceased. Silence fell, not dead, but full like the moment before a heartbeat returns. The Orks looked around, confused. They blinked, scratched their heads, and went back to fighting each other. They had forgotten again. And the galaxy sighed in relief. In the centuries that followed, the Imperium rebuilt. New cults arose, worshipping the memory of the Green Suns as divine deliverance. The Ecclesiarchy renamed it the Mercy of Violence. The Mechanicus called it the Great Calibration. But the Orks, the only ones who had been there, truly they never spoke of it. When asked, they only laughed and said, "We fixed it, then broke it again. That's how things work." And maybe they were right. Because in the end, the last WAAGH was not apocalypse. It was revelation. It proved that the universe, at its core, does not crave peace or chaos, order or anarchy. It craves continuance. To fight is to exist. To laugh is to affirm that existence. And in that affirmation lies godhood. The Krorks were never gone. They were waiting not for worship, but for rhythm. Not for prophecy, but for a punchline. Now, when warp storms flicker green, or a moon explodes for no reason, or an Ork gun fires a shot that should be impossible, the galaxy remembers. Not fully, not consciously, but enough to smile. Because somewhere out there, Beyond the veil of time and death, the Krorks are still laughing. They are the proof that even gods break, repair, and break again. That nothing ends, it just gets louder. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But if you listen closely, beneath the roar of bolters and the cries of dying stars, you can still hear it. A laugh, a breath, a heartbeat, and the whisper of a god that never left. Still here. Long after the last WARAGH, the galaxy slept. It was not peace. Peace requires witnesses. It was something else. A long breath, held between endings. A calm so wide that even the warp forgot to whisper. The stars hung motionless, pale scars in the skin of night. Worlds spun on out of habit, empty and patient. The galaxy had broken itself, rebuilt itself, and broken again too many times to remember why. And yet, it still moved. Because motion, once begun, refuses to stop. On one forgotten world, under the light of a cracked moon, a child sat beside her grandmother. They lived aboard a relic ship, its hull half embedded in the desert sand, its engines older than language. No one knew what the ship had once been. To them, it was simply home. Every evening, when the green sun dipped low, the grandmother would speak. Her voice was cracked like old metal, but steady, rhythmic, the kind of tone that feels like memory even when you don't understand the words. She told stories of the green gods, of beings so big their laughter moved mountains, of stars that hummed like engines, of a war so long that even time got tired. The child would listen, wide-eyed. Did they win? She always asked. And the old woman smiled the smile of someone who knows the answer and the futility of saying it aloud. They didn't have to, she said. They just kept going. When night fell, the ship would hum. Not from power, its reactors had been dead for centuries, but from something older. Something in the metal that remembered movement. It was the hum of the universe itself, traveling along the bones of forgotten machines. Sometimes, if the wind was right, the sand would vibrate. Tiny grains dancing to a rhythm no ear could fully catch. The child called it the big song. The grandmother called it the memory of work. Because, in truth, it was neither miracle nor ghost. It was just the sound of the galaxy continuing. Elsewhere, in the ruins of Mechanicus forges, servitors still moved in patterns no master had ordered. Hands rusted, optics cracked. They repeated gestures older than their programming, turning gears that no longer meshed, aligning cogs that no longer fit, as if the act itself held meaning even without function. In a way, it did. Every movement was prayer through habit. Every spark, worship through inertia. The Krorks had been forgotten. The Orks had thinned. Humanity had dimmed into memory. But the rhythm remained. The warp was quiet now, a vast ocean at low tide. The dark gods still drifted, reduced to shapes without appetite. They whispered, not in rage, but in longing. "Where did the laughter go?" asked Khorne, his rivers of blood gone still. "It ended," murmured Tzeentch. "No," said Nurgle, with the patience of rot. "It's just waiting." And Slaanesh, silent for the first time since birth, closed their eyes and smiled. Because even they could feel it. The faint vibration running through eternity, like the echo of a hammer striking metal light years away. It was the heartbeat of the god in green, not awake, not asleep, but working. On a world made entirely of glass, a single figure wandered. She was small, a caretaker, human in form, though her eyes glowed faintly with machine light. Her name had been forgotten, but her duty had not. She called herself Arn Val, the listener. Each day, she would kneel in the dust and listen to the ground. She heard the faint hum beneath her, a rhythm so deep it could not be heard, only felt. A pulse beneath the crust of the world. Her log entries were brief. Still working. Still humming. Still here. She did not know who she reported to. Perhaps no one. Perhaps everyone. Because duty, once born, does not require an audience. One day, or what passed for a day, the hum grew louder. The ground trembled. The horizon turned green. Not bright, not fierce, gentle, like dawn filtered through fog. Arn looked up. Above her, the stars shifted. They aligned, slowly, delicately, like gears finding their place in a forgotten machine. For the first time in an age, the heavens clicked. A quiet voice spoke in her mind, not words, but feeling. A warmth that said, "You've kept it running." Anne smiled. "I just held the wrench," she whispered. "That's all anyone ever did." In that moment, the galaxy adjusted itself. Not through miracle, but maintenance. Broken orbits straightened. Dead stars flared one last time to light the path of younger ones. The hum rose to a chorus, quiet, infinite, content. It was not the return of gods. It was not the rebirth of empires. It was the sound of work finished and beginning again. On that desert world, the child woke in the middle of the night. She thought she heard something outside, a low vibration, like footsteps the size of mountains. She went to the window. Far on the horizon, a silhouette moved, vast, impossible, familiar. A figure of light and shadow, bent over as if adjusting the stars by hand. The child gasped. "Grandmother," she cried. "He's real. The green god is real." The old woman stirred, eyes glinting in the dark. She didn't look surprised. She just smiled. "Of course he's real," she said softly. "Someone has to keep the lights on." By morning, the horizon was empty again, but the stars shone brighter. The ship hummed louder, and the child, when she laughed, swore she could hear the universe laugh back. Time passed. Aunt Val's ship, the Continuum, repaired, continued its endless drift. Her log, the last one ever recorded by a living mind, ended with a single line: "Everything breaks. That's how you know it's alive." 1,000 millennia later, when nothing remained but dust and rhythm, when every star had folded inward and every god had gone quiet, the universe hummed one final note. Not loud, not mournful, just steady. A hinge closing, a hand finishing its work. A laugh, faint but infinite, and in that moment, at the end of all beginnings, a whisper moved through the dark. "Your turn." Then the light went out. But somewhere, beyond the edge of ending, a green spark blinked. Small, patient, ready to start again.